And I hope that my students who are here and that I will have in the future will have a place like my friends and I had at Casey's, a place that we knew when we left we were always welcome back. And so Merle Casey and his wife Florence moved to Celina, Ohio, and settled at 322 North Buckeye Street in 1928, and set up the store at 318 North Buckeye Street. And for the next 40 years, Merle was a local neighborhood grocer. He even took the time when he built his steps to put C for the family namesake. It's still there today. But if you don't remember what 1928 was, it was the last year for many years of prosperity, not only in Celina, but all across the nation. The Great Depression was upon us, and Merle set up shop just prior to that.
Dear Red Cross, my children need books and clothes so they can go to school. If my mules don't die this winter and I can get something for them to eat, I'm going to try to make a crop here next year. I don't want the Red Cross to give me nothing, but if you'll help me and give me time, I'll pay you for all that you do for me. Signed, A.C. Blount.
In Arkansas, the state hardest hit by drought, the agricultural crisis closed 1/4 of the banks. Red Cross relief money was frozen. As aid ran out, people faced starvation.
I look back myself now and am surprised at how little awareness there seemed to be in Washington of what was going on around the country. Opinion in the newspapers was pretty much Republican. And it was in the interest of the Republican owners of the newspapers to play down bad news about the state of the economy and play up good news, because bad news would suggest that there was something wrong with the Hoover administration.
And so you know what the historical conditions of the nation were in the 1928 era when Florence and Merle began their small grocery on, at that time, the very north edge of Celina. It wasn't too long after the article appeared in the Daily Standard last spring that I received numerous phone calls and letters concerning Casey's Grocery, because it was a popular grocery in Celina. And one letter came from Florida, and it was from Mrs. Eileen George, who is a daughter of Merle Casey. She wrote, I read the article in the Standard requesting information regarding Casey's Grocery. I am a daughter of Merle Casey, so I'll try to supply a little of that information. I cannot tell you when the grocery started, but I would guess somewhere near the 1930s. My father had previously been owner of a small grocery in Goshen, Indiana, before coming to Celina. The grocery in Celina was a family-owned and operated facility with Merle, his wife Florence, and 3 children, Bob, Tom, and Casey, all helping out. His specialty was fresh-cut meat. He used to buy his beef by the half, which he kept in a walk-in cooler. Many times a day he would bring the huge side of beef out of the chopping block and cut off whatever the customer demanded. Then back to the cooler it would go. Also, he had a nice selection of cold cuts which came in bulk form. I can still hear the electric slicer buzzing away and see my dad pop a piece into his mouth as well as offer the customer a slice. He used to make daily car deliveries of groceries to people who couldn't or didn't want to come out. The fresh eggs he sold were purchased from a farmer and kept in a big wicker basket. The customer would sack whatever amount he wanted. Probably his largest clientele were the school kids who walked by to buy candy and soft drinks, then sit on the front steps of the grocery and savor every bite. A few years went by, and Dad decided it would be best to put a couple of benches on either side of the steps for the kids. The adult customers got a little irritated trying to walk around them. I remember so well when I was finally old enough to work into the grocery, dusting and stocking shelves. The sky was the limit when I got to the candy counter. Dad used to tease us kids about eating up all the profit. After many successful years in the grocery, my dad decided he could no longer compete with the larger supermarkets that had come to Celina, and his health wasn't the best. So he closed the grocery in 1968 and rented the building out to various enterprises. At this date, I'm not aware of the building, if it is or is not occupied, as the property was sold a number of years ago. I hope this will give you some information that you can use. At this writing, we are wintering in Florida, but we'll be heading back north on March 25th. Sincerely, Mrs. David Eileen George. Yes, Mrs. George, the information was helpful, and I sincerely thank you for sharing those years and experiences with us. And yes, to another question, it is rented currently and has been rented numerous times over the years, but it seems none have lasted. It seems the structure at 318 North Buckeye Street was designated to be a small neighborhood grocery. There were other letters and phone calls concerning Casey's, just people who wanted to say, I shopped there and bought my meat there or bought candy there. I received a letter from a neighborhood child who grew up just behind Casey's. Mrs. Beth Smalley, or her maiden name was Cook. She wrote, Casey's store was located down the alley from our home on East Anthony Street. Many times as small children, my sisters and brothers and I walked through the neighbors' backyards to Casey's to get a loaf of bread or milk or whatever our mother desired. One thing we'll always remember about Casey's were the surprise sacks one could buy there. Surprise sacks was a small brown paper bag with 5 cents worth of candy in it. Many times when our dad came home from work for lunch, he would give us each a nickel to go to Casey's to buy a surprise snack. Others remembered Merle Casey.
Guy. And yeah, I used to buy a lot of groceries over there because on my way home from work, I could stop there and buy meat or, canned goods or cereal. And just, he had everything. Yeah, he was called the first out and he did a good business.
Now the article in the newspaper where he was robbed.
Well, I don't remember that, but he could have been.
Robbed, and they caught the man somewhere up in Fort Wayne, and Merle had to go up and identify him.
Oh.
It was 1932 during the Depression.
I was over there one day, and his brother Merle was from Indiana, and his brother was there. And, they looked so much alike, you could hardly tell them apart. They were about the same size, and talked alike. And they weren't twins, they were just very much alike.
On February 27, 1932, the front page read, M.T. Casey called to Lynn, Indiana on Friday, where he positively identified Mark Houston as one of the men who robbed him last Saturday night. Robber shot at Van Wert, has bullet in back. Merle T. Casey, grocer of North Buckeye Street, was called by Van Wert officials on Friday morning to accompany them to Lynn, Indiana, to identify a Lynn resident as a young man who assisted in the robberies last Saturday night. Mr. Casey Williams, a Van Wert grocer, and Mr. Carey, who was a customer in the Ditto grocery, which was held up and robbed 2 weeks ago, were able to identify Mark Houston, 23, of Lynn, as being one of the grocery store robbers. Houston was confined to his bed at his father's home at Lynn as a result of being shot by Mrs. Williams in an attempted robbery at the Van Wert grocery about 2 hours after Casey's store was robbed. When Houston and his partner entered Williams' store, Mr. and Mrs. Williams were just getting ready to close for the night. They saw the two bandits enter the front door and were on their guard. When they came into the back room, Mrs. Williams had a gun and was waiting. The robber approached Mr. Williams with his sawed-off shotgun. Before he realized what was happening, Mrs. Williams shot him. His partner assisted him in a hasty retreat without taking Williams' money, and they got away before the Van Wert officials arrived at the store. The bullet entered Houston's chest and lodged in his back. Has denied everything, but because of the positive identification of the three men, Houston was removed to the Winchester, Indiana hospital where he was placed under guard. On Saturday morning, he was x-rayed, and authorities expected to have him removed to the county jail where he will be held for trial. According to Casey's daughter, Merle never received his money that was stolen in that robbery, but he settled for a ruby ring one of the robbers was wearing. Usually things were not that exciting on North Buckeye Street in the small neighborhood grocery. Typical scene is what you're looking at now, kids gathering in front of Casey's. This particular day, Gene Spicer, M.L. Spicer's son, sat on the hood of the car with Bob Casey on the far right, and in the middle was another neighborhood child named Don Winklejohn. But all across America, robberies were typical. It was a time of the great and most famous robbers America ever witnessed.
In 1931, as prices continued to fall, the entire farm economy approached collapse.
Went to the bank to borrow some money. Tell you right now, didn't find it funny. The banker said he had none to loan. Get your old hat and pull out home. For all I got's gone. All I got's gone.
There was a terrific amount of anguish and trauma on three sides. One from the bankers themselves who could not meet the demands of their depositors. There was anguish on the part of depositors who could not get their money out, and there was anguish on the part of farmers, especially, who were beginning to lose their farm because of not being able to pay, and pretty soon it became a calamity.
Oh, there's no place upon this earth that's home, sweet home to me.
Even Betty Boop lost her farm, as thousands of mortgages were called in by the banks. It seemed that all America was for sale.
There was considerable bitterness. The feeling against bankers turned from, well, this is the man we ought to listen to this is a person that hasn't done us any good.
Now as through this world I ramble, I see lots of funny men. Some will rob you with a 6-gun, some with a fountain pen.
Well, they needed to hear all about that. You know, the banks were going under and taking people's money and foreclosing on farms and everything. And I think that the people felt that my father was just one of them kind of striking back for all of them.
From 1929 to 1931, as the economic crisis deepened, bank robberies increased dramatically.
There had been so many bank robberies around that it was quite often that a customer would come in and jokingly say, "This is a holdup." And so I happened to have my back to the counter at the moment, and this fellow hollered, "This is a holdup." And I said, "Oh, yeah." Turned around, and sure enough, the gun was right in my face. Most of them were small robberies. By that I mean they were small banks. And, of course, it was kind of a disgrace to get robbed by anybody except Pretty Boy Floyd.
Floyd was a wanted man in states across America's Farm Belt. But in the small towns where he robbed banks, farmers talked of Floyd tearing up mortgages and giving money to the poor. Charles Pretty Boy Floyd was becoming a legend.
There's a many a starving farmers, the same old story told, how this outlaw paid their mortgage and saved their little home.
Charlie came to our house. Now, this is my first remembrance of him. He came to our house, and Mother was telling him about a family that lived out the edge of town. Mother said, well, this family out there really needs some help. You know, the kids don't even have shoes to go to school. And he said, well, let's get some groceries, or Mother said that. They agreed together they were going to get groceries, so Mother said, well, Ruth knows the way. I crawled in there and showed Charlie how to go out to their farmhouse. So Charlie gets out of the car and puts the basket of groceries on the porch. And then he gave me a bill and put it in my hand, and he said, Dink. I was tiny then, he called me Dinky. But he said, Dink, give this man this bill and tell him to buy his children some shoes.
Pretty Boy Floyd, an outlaw, Oklahoma knew him well.
Floyd was, frankly, a little smarter than most of the average bank robbers, to where he would move out of one area and he would hit maybe 100 miles away.
In 1931, Pretty Boy Floyd embarked on a robbing spree that took him from Oklahoma, through Missouri, east to Ohio, and then home to Oklahoma, where Floyd knew that for a few dollars, a poor farm family would gladly hide him out. In 5 months, Floyd stole more than $12,000.
We used to hear about Pretty Boy Floyd. There were some other outlaws. I can't think of their names now. Mostly we had to talk about, we talk about that kind of stuff, you know, get a lot of fun out of it.
They'd follow his escapades in the paper, you know, and it was kind of like they were pulling for him to stay at large instead of being killed.
Hello, Louis.
Depression America was fascinated by the underworld. Outlaws and gangsters on the screen and on the streets seemed unstoppable. In Oklahoma, which led the nation in bank robberies in 1932, officials appealed to the citizens to turn in Pretty Boy Floyd, who was accused of 6 killings and 10 robberies.
He really didn't spend all that money that he robbed. To him, I think it began to be a game in the beginning, and then it got more serious, you know.
In early 1932, Oklahoma bankers intensified efforts to capture Floyd. They hired Irv Kelly, a retired sheriff, to lead the manhunt.
Floyd's wife had moved down to live with her parents, and the telephone operator let my father know that Floyd had been calling his wife, and Floyd had told her he was coming, and that was the way that they were able to set up the trap. It was in nighttime, and Irv Kelly and some more people were staked out, and in those days you had gates to keep the stock in, and somebody had to stop and open the gate to go into where we live. We live back in the field. Along about 2 o'clock in the morning, it got quite cold, and the fellows at this one end of the road that they thought Floyd would come in decided to go into Bixby, which was 2 miles, and get some coffee. While all of this was transpiring, Floyd came in through this place where these officers had left. And so my father got out to open the gate, and Irv Kelly stepped out from behind the chicken house. My dad could not be positive that it was Floyd, because those officers would have given him a signal if Floyd came through, and they were to come up and block, you know, the thing off. So when they came up to open the gate,
and my dad stepped out. Then the gun battle started, and my dad was killed.
The killing turned the public against the outlaw Pretty Boy Floyd.
We just heard about it. We don't ever know him coming in here doing anything for anybody in this area. We would just hear about it. They call him a kind of Robin Hood.
It's nice to be a Robin Hood, I'm sure. But if you come and take my bread when I need it to eat and go give it to somebody else, you're not a Robin Hood to me.
Floyd would remain at large for 2 more years until FBI agents cornered and shot him in an Ohio cornfield. But the crime wave of the early Depression years continued to feed fears that America was coming apart.
All I got gone, all I got gone.
As agricultural crisis...
Gene Spicer, a young man in the lower left-hand corner in front of the White Mountain Creamery Company, which was started by M.L. Spicer in January of 1925. This is approximately 1927, according to Gene.
This is a picture of outside the dairy where we first started. The big brown truck there is the one that hauled our milk into us. No refrigeration, just had all ice to ice stuff down. The man standing beside of the horse and wagon was a man by the name of Alfred Netterman. I can't tell who the rest of the people in the picture are.
So they can still look at the picture.
This was later on. We had a bigger truck, an old Dodge. It was driven by Gleason Roebuck, and then that's my father on the other side of the truck there. This was a picture of an old Model A Ford truck that my dad had. That's he on the left-hand side, and a fellow by the name of Slim, and I can't remember his last name, and there I am at about 6 or 7 years old.
Here is the East School building, which would be directly west of the Meadow Gold Milk Company. This is their float that they had in 1939. That is M.L. Spicer on the far right. And in the middle, if you can see, that is Naomi Mallory, who later became Naomi Spicer, Gene's wife, who was riding the float that day. The other ladies are, the top is Ruth Ann Hammond Williams, and in the bottom right, that is Jeanette Wright Berger.
This is a picture of Albert Bolenbacher driving the truck, and Johnny Fisher, who now works for McKernan Brothers, and his dad Pete in the back in front of their store. You might have noticed that we are now Meadow Gold Milk, which is a division of Beatrice Foods, which was sold out, who bought White Mountain Dairies in mid-30s sometime. That's all I know. This is a picture of Merle Casey's grocery, and it's also some of my cronies. I'm sitting on the left there on top of the hood of this old Buick, I think it is, and Don Winklejohn, who lived next door, and that's Bob Casey, who was the same age. All three of us were all about the same age. We had a shack built out back of this store that we all played in. Had a lot of good times down there. And as I got older, I got out on the milk route myself, and it was during the high school years where I'd go in the summertime with the different drivers, and this is one of the stores we delivered to. I I think there were probably about 28 or 30 different stores, neighborhood stores just like this that we delivered to. And now what? We also delivered mostly house to house. That was the first thing that my father did. It was all by horse and wagon. And I probably went on the milk route when I was about 4 years old the first time, riding in the horse and wagon. Down the street, several of the houses around there are people that I remember. One of them was a Reisner, lived in about the 300 block, and one of the boys that lived there, one of the sons, was Jerry Reisner, who had the grocery that originally belonged to Joe Shambaugh. And I think that Jerry's neighborhood grocery was probably about the last one that was around here. Now, going down Buckeye Street to the south of Casey's Grocery, in the next block, about in the middle of the block, was the old Hebert Ice House, which started, in, I think, in 1898. And I don't remember Mike, but I remember Ann, his daughter. I think that's right.
Good evening. I'm Mary Ellen Winklejohn, and it was my privilege to be a lifelong neighbor of the Casey family. I live at 416 East Anthony Street, and Casey's were right on the corner of Buckeye and Anthony. We were very good neighbors. There was never a fight between either family. The picture you're seeing here is taken at our backyard. My dad had built this cookout, so to speak, and as you can see, the back there is a building. This building was built on the back end of the Louis Soccer property, and it contained 3 garages. I can remember they used to put trucks, and also they had a delivery ice wagon. I think it was even pulled by a horse, but they would keep that in one of these garages. The dark space at the end by the front of the truck was what they called an auxiliary ice house. In the winter, when Mike Hemmert would cut the ice on the lake, they would take that ice and put it in the main ice house, which was, well, the building I think is still standing, which was behind the Hemmert house on the corner of Fulton, on the corner of East Fulton and Buckeye Street. And then when that house was filled, they would fill this place, this auxiliary, and then in the summer when they needed the ice, they would take it out of here and they would take that over to the main place. Another thing I remember is, as kids, we always watched when they would come back to fill this the ice out of here, because there would be hunks of ice, and as kids would go in the summer, we would always make sure we had a hunk of ice, or Mr. Hemmert would even sometimes chip off ice and we had something nice to suck on. The bush there, to speak, by there, that too, that all was things. There was a bush there that was I can't remember what it was exactly, but my mother would use it in jelly. I remember that. And then there was a mulberry tree, and that property and the mulberry tree right next to this garage was the original home of Lawrence and Irma Evans' mother. And I remember them as a child also. They're an awfully good grape arbor. Just how old this picture is, I don't know, but if you look, we're looking east down Anthony Street, and the faint shadow of a building in the background is the Celina Manufacturing Company. Today there is a football field, plus Anthony Street is completely through all the way to, I can't think of the name of the street. It runs alongside the football stadium. What does it make any difference? But the houses ended where Harlemarts live on the north side of the street. I can't think of the street, the house that's on the south side of the street. But also another thing that's interesting as a child, and you might like to know, Anthony Street at one time was the only street in Celina that was paved. I remember this when this street was mud. And many a time we went in the house and we were just a slight bit dirty. But also on the other side of the street, you'll notice a car over to your left. Well, that is College Street. And that was parked alongside of, at that time, there were tennis courts there by the East School building. There were 4 tennis courts there. And on Saturday, that was a very, very busy place because everybody in town came to the East School building to play tennis on Saturday morning in the summer. This shot is looking north, and this is directly across from my home on East Anthony Street. This is Don Winklejohn here in the front part of the picture. That's the same Don that's sitting on the front of the Buick with Gene Spicer and Bob Casey, and the little girl is Don's daughter, Judy. The houses here are, the one right next to the alley belonged to Hainlines. Several other people had lived in the house, but I remember it predominantly as Hainlines. And the next house was Lothar Slusser's, and maybe some of you remember Dick Slusser or Marcy Slusser Culp. And then Bill Slusser was the youngest son, and he married Marcille Reesner, and they now live in Van Wert. Marcy married Clark Culp, and they too live in Van Wert. Now, the Slusser house and the Hainline house were torn down, and they now act as part of the parking lot of the Methodist Church that sits across there on the other side of Anthony Street. The house on the corner is now where Paul Maxwell lives, and that's the only house remaining there on that whole block. Now, this is north of Casey's on Anthony Street. Now, let's go south of Casey over towards Fulton Street. Directly alongside Casey's store on the side, there was an alley. Now, this alley extended from College Street to Buckeye Street. There was a side alley that came into the alley, the main alley, from Fulton Street. And they met at the corner right behind Evans's. Now, on Saturday morning, when I was a child, we were in the Depression area. The house on the corner that is now the home of Carl Pugh, which is a new house, but formerly there was a house that stood there, and for a time in the 30s, the early 30s, I could say the late 20s, but I'm not too sure about that, that was called to us that lived in the neighborhood the Depression House. And the reason it was called the Depression House was that many times, and especially on Saturday mornings, down the alleys would come old trucks and even horse and buggies, and many people even brought wagons. And they would come to the Depression House. I've seen people leave there with blankets. They left there with food and everything else. The house had had 4 rooms downstairs, and there were offices set up in those 4 rooms. Just exactly what they did in all 4 rooms, I do not know, because when the Saturdays came, more or less, we kids had to stay indoors, or we had to stay in the backyard. We were not permitted to run across the alley or anything like that. That was restricted. The house, after the Depression sort of subsided, was empty for a time, and then Albine Hemmert, the son of Mike Hemmert, moved in there with his family, and then there were 2 children in that family. Jack, who was the oldest and who would be later after graduation moved on to Muncie, and Patty Hemmert, who is Patty McGee and still lives here in the Celina area. After Hemmerts left that house, the Herbert Curry family moved in, and I think today that many of you remember Mrs. Curry because she was a teacher in the public school system. Listening to Jean talk about the White Mountain Creamery, I remember that so well too. And many is the time that I had to walk down there and get a quart of milk or something like that when Casey's store had run out. Got to remember at that time too, you might notice it said milk is a bottle. That was always in a glass bottle. It was never in any cardboard or anything like that. And I washed out a lot of milk bottles in my life. Casey's store, though, that Jean also referred to the shack in the back of the store. That shack was built out of old lumber from the barn that they tore down to build the store. I remember that. And there's another thing that Jean forgot. They built that on the back of the store. In other words, the guys built 3 sides. The 4th side was the back of the store. It was very small. In fact, when those 3 guys got in there, there wasn't room for anything else. And maybe that's why that was always off limits for women or girls. We used to make fudge, popcorn, and everything else, tried to get in that place. But Iona, Jean's sister, and I and Marcy Slusser, we never did end up in that place because that was just off limits. That's what you call prejudice, even back then. Casey store, well, we would always go out the back door of our house, cut across the backyard, go across Casey's backyard, and in the side door. The side door of the store went in behind the meat counter. One thing that always struck me about Casey was his meat block. In all the time that he had that store, he used 2 meat blocks. Now, a meat block table, if anyone is real familiar with that, that's a lot of wood. And from scraping off that table and trying to keep that clean, that table got so it was almost at an indirect 45-degree angle from all the meat that Casey had cut. The store. If you came in the front door, to your right would be the candy case. That was quite a candy case. And in those days, dum-dums were the size of a $0.50. A dum-dum sucker was the size of a $0.50, but you bought it for a penny. There was a BB bat. I don't think anybody today knows what a BB bat sucker is. The Baby Ruth bar was about 5 times bigger than what you buy today, and it was a nickel. Of course, in those days, too, if you had a penny, you were lucky. You got a nickel, you were rich. But that candy case was quite a thing, not only for the neighborhood, but for all the kids that would come over from the East School at noon. He did quite a penny business. In the front window of that grocery store, also to your right as you went in the door, he always had a bunch of bananas hanging in that window. When they got the bananas in, they were in a long box, and he would get 2, I don't know what you would call them, 2 bunches. And he would hang up 1 bunch at a time, and they were always grass green. They were never part ripe. They were just grass green. And the longer they hung there, of course, the riper they got. And we used to keep us out of there. I don't know whether he was kidding us or not, but he would tell us that bananas had spiders in them, and you didn't want to get bit by that spider because it was deadly. never did see one of those spiders. To the left, as you came into the store, he would have bushel baskets. And if you went over there to buy apples or pears or potatoes or anything like that, you went to the baskets and he would put so many sack, whatever you wanted, and then he would weigh it. Generally, Mom would send us over there, and we had to get a quarter's worth of apples. It was never a bag of apples or anything like that. It was a quarter's worth of apples. Another thing that I remember so acutely, and that's the vinegar barrel. You used to take a quart mason jar, and you would go over there, and you would have to pump it. There was a pump in this barrel, and he would pump the vinegar out until you got a quart of vinegar, and that's what you would take home. And another thing was the milk. You know, used to when you made cold slaw or anything like that, you made a cream for the top. You would buy a quart of milk. You never bought cream by the half pint or anything like that. And then you would take it home and you would skim some of that cream off of the top to make your dressing for the cold slaw. That was very good in those days. Now, also in those days, you didn't always have a dollar bill or something like that to go to the grocery store, and you didn't give that to kids above all when you sent them there. And Casey would always, when you got done, he had a drawer right near the cash register, and he would pull out that drawer, and that drawer was the same drawer, and it was still in place when he went out of business. It had slots in it, and in that he would have a regular little credit book, so to speak, and the names of all the people in the neighborhood were on there. There was the name of McKernan, the name of Spicer, the name of Slusser, the name of Hemmelgarn, the name of Hemmert, the name of Socker, Winklejohn, Gass, and Johnson. Addie Johnson also lived in our neighborhood. Can't forget that. But anyway, and he would always write it down, and generally about every 2 weeks, if you were fortunate enough to be paid, or maybe once a month, Mom would go to the grocery store and she would pay the bill, and we always waited till she came home because we knew one thing: there would be a sucker for each one of us kids or some loose candy of some kind. Casey always did that. He always had something extra to give to the kids. Gradually things did change. Oh, and there's something else that I have to tell you about. Casey's store, you got to remember, when it was built, had to have heat in it. And they had a base burner in that store. The chimney is still there. And he would have to start that fire in that stove in the morning and to get warmth into the store. And I always remember he had the breakfast food to the right of that stove, and that breakfast food, when you get it, you take it home, it was always warm. Not that you ate it that way, but that's where he kept the breakfast food. The shelves were all along both sides of the walls, on both sides of the store, the north and the south walls. The center part of it was generally always taken up with some kind of produce or something like that. Casey was a very good butcher. I think he learned his trade from his brother Frank, who their home was in Indiana, up around Muncie, Goshen, near Goshen. And many times Frank would come down, but Casey was quite a meat cutter. And in those days, you went there, he got the slab of meat out of the cooler, and he would cut exactly what you wanted, the way you wanted it cut. He never had, I can't remember that he ever had live chickens or anything like that. I can remember he had eggs and things. As far as cheeses and things like that are concerned, I don't remember things like that. He used to have an awfully good selection of cold cuts. I remember that. But the store, you could just about go into Casey's store and get anything you wanted, from brooms to steaks. You could get a T-bone steak, and you could get a little tiny broom. You could get a dustpan. You could get a scour, something to scour out the sink. You could get any kind of canned vegetable, and you could get canned fruit. And this is the front view of Casey's. That tree, we used to watch it green in the spring, give it shade in the summer, and in the winter it was a mess to clean up, but we even helped rake leaves. One thought that is rather dim in my mind, because this is a time when I was in the first or second grade, and that is that Casey's at one time was robbed, and it happened in the same time area as the Limburg baby kidnapping. And parents, just as parents today, they protect your children. And even though we lived next door to Casey's, whenever we would have to go to the store after that robbery, Mother would always watch from the kitchen window, making sure that we got in that side door and that we could come home again. We were restricted. We could go to the corner on Anthony and Buckeye, but we could not turn the corner because Casey's was a busy grocery store. And even though through all the years other things have come in and gone out of the store since Merle T. Casey sold and closed his store, no matter how many are there, to those of us that have lived in the neighborhood and that knew Merle and knew Flossie, that store will always be Casey's.
And so Casey continued working 6 days a week for over 40 years. Things did not change all that much on North Buckeye, nor have they changed that much today. Many of the same homes and families still live in the neighborhood. Norbert's empty lot across from Casey now sports an apartment complex. But for 40 years that Casey was in operation, it lay idle, with only an occasional neighborhood ball game occupying it, and then the players mad dash across the road for a pop or a snack at Casey's. The Depression House has long been gone, but the memories and stories about it will remain on the corner of Anthony and Buckeye for as long as there are people living who experienced those agonizing years. In the late 60s, times were changing, and the neighborhood grocer was struggling to survive against the new supermarkets that were springing up all across the country. Merle T. Casey's health was failing, and in 1968, after 40 years of business, Casey closed his doors. Less than 2 years later, on Christmas Day, 1970, Merle T. Casey died at the age of 78. Florence, better known as Flossie to her friends and neighbors and customers, continued living on the corner of Buckeye and Fulton until she died on December 10, 1984, at the age of 84. The first store on the grocery list is finally compiled. We will continue bringing you weekly stories on the numerous groceries that dotted the streets of Celina, and hopefully at the same time provide you with some local history of Celina, refresh memories about times that were obviously special, and more importantly, preserve and share those good times with children who have no knowledge of depressions and world wars and meat-cutting blocks and sacks filled with candy because the debt was paid.